I'm Sumi Somaskanda with DW here in the US, and today we are interviewing Cas Mudde. He is a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia and also at the Center for Research on Extremism. He is an expert on political extremism and populism. In the wake of the shooting in Buffalo, where the Black community in particular was targeted and 10 people were killed, I wanted to ask him about far-right terror attacks, the Great Replacement theory, and what it tells us about political extremism. Cas, thanks so much for joining us today. The Great Replacement theory, that a group of powerful elites are controlling the US government, the media, and that they're trying to replace white Americans with people of color. Where did this idea come from?
Well, in its most modern variety, it originated with a French author called Jean Raspail, who wrote a book, The Camp of the Saints, in 1973. And since then, it has been around in far-right circles, pretty prominent actually, since at least the 1980s. And more recently, another French author, Camus, wrote about the Great Replacement, and that is what you now often see referred. But broader, this idea of an elite trying to replace the original population with immigrants who are more docile so that they can control them has been around for a very long time. I would say even the mid-19th century here in the US.
Who are these elites that are being referred to?
Well, that is often implicit, but initially it was, in many theories, very explicit. It was the Jews. Later, it was either big capital, which quite often is also the Jews, or left-wing parties. And you see it, particularly since the 1980s, 1990s, more referring to left-wing groups. And now the newest iteration, which brings everything back, is George Soros, the Hungarian Jewish financier. And so he combines both the left and the Jewish and big capital part.
Okay, and you've made the point that we should not be amplifying the manifesto that the shooter in Buffalo allegedly left behind. But I do want to ask you about the fact that in his manifesto, he refers to the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019 as the tipping point. We saw similar language around the Utoya shooting in Norway. Why do you think we're seeing a growing number of attacks fueled by this theory?
Well, first of all, there is social media spreads everything much faster, but the media in general is often very obsessed with these kind of what they call lone wolves who attack things, particularly if they're far right. They give them a lot of attention. They mention their name endlessly, and so they become within the movement. These people become kind of like heroes. With regard to the Great Replacement theory, it has really mainstream. And you see that, for example, here in the US, with Tucker Carlson, of course, on Fox News, but also high-ranking Republicans like Elise Stefanik. But even like yesterday, in the new speech as the new, for his new term as Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban referred literally to the Great Replacement theory. So this is no longer a theory from some marginal groups on the far right. This is within the broader mainstream right now.
I'll come back to the European angle in a second, but just to follow up on this Great Replacement theory, DW spoke to members of the Black community in Buffalo who said, "You call this replacement, for us this is just plain racism." Would you agree with that?
No, obviously underlying the Great Replacement theory is the racist idea that non-white people are inferior, right? That's why they're being brought in, because they're more docile. So this is not just a replacement of white Americans by white Norwegians or something. This is by non-whites, and they do that because the assumption is that these people are inferior. So it's absolutely old school racist.
If we come back to the European aspect now, this is something that we've seen in Germany, certainly among the far right there, this use of the Great Replacement theory. But how deeply seated is it in Europe as well?
I've started researched the far right in the late 80s, early 90s. It was already a prominent theory then in parties like the Center Party, Front National, all kinds of parties. Like, this is really one of the key ideas. And there it was almost always linked to the left. This is what the left, and for the far right, of course, the left includes everything up until like the Christian Democrats. This is what they do. Now, again, it has become more prominent in part because the far right has become more prominent. So now you see it with Eric Zemmour, for example, in France, and you see it even with prime ministers like Viktor Orban.
Can you help us pick apart a little bit how this has become mainstream and how people like the shooter in Buffalo can become radicalized? I mean, what are the factors leading to that?
Well, these are two different processes. So the mainstreaming is something that happens largely outside of the far right itself. It is other actors, both in the media, in politics, in cultural sectors, who are picking up on these ideas. And a lot of this goes back to 9/11 pretty much, which shifted the whole debate from socioeconomic to social cultural, and shifted our debate about multiculturalism and immigration, becoming much more negative, to the extent that pretty much there was a consensus in 2015-16 in a lot of circles that immigration is a threat to national identity and national security. Now, if you're there, then it is not a big step to get into the Great Replacement theory. Now, the process of radicalization is at a much more individual level. And to be honest, that is quite difficult to generalize upon. This particular shooter has his own narrative of what has happened. And I think we should be very careful about taking that for granted. He kind of argues that he radicalized during the pandemic and online. In general, that's highly unlikely. It's not as if he was totally pro-multicultural, then there was a lockdown and he got sucked in. He probably had these ideas already, and he probably had them from mainstream media or family or whatever other his church are. But we do know that the pandemic has radicalized certain people, because you get lonely, you get isolated, and you live online in a bubble that you narrow down more and more.
Okay, so that's a contributing factor. How much do you think, on a larger scale, in the US and also in Europe, does this have to do with demographics? The fact that on a whole in a country like the US is going to, at some point in the near future, see white Americans actually be in the minority?
Well, so this is a major difference between the US and Western Europe, right? I mean, the US is far more diverse in ethnic/racial terms than any country, even France or Britain. Since at least the 1980s, but probably even before that, there has been growing anxiety within white, particularly right-wing, and also Christian circles, that the US is becoming a majority minority country. And already for decades, they point to the year 2050 when that would happen. Now, that was all even heightened by the fact that Barack Obama became the first Black president. And that was kind of like a sign for many who were vulnerable for this and who worry about whites no longer being majority. It's like, look, they already have the president, right? And so Barack Obama, as president, created an even more feverish debate about this demographic change. And that has been heightened then, of course, by the whole Trumpification of the Republican Party.
If we look at where things stand now, the Biden administration has said that the greatest threat to American security is violent extremism fueled by white supremacy. And I read that you said that you don't believe that the far-right threat is primarily a security threat. What did you mean by that?
So I don't think that the biggest threat is violent domestic extremism fueled by white supremacy. I do believe that the biggest domestic violent threat is from white supremacy. But in the end, individual shooters or even smaller groups of terrorists are not threatening US society, let alone the US political system. What is threatening the system is white supremacy that has pretty much captured the Republican Party, the larger conservative movement, including Fox News. Like, we now have across the nation, like Republican legislators who are undermining the democratic system, who are pretty much whipping up fear and anger over a southern border and a crisis at a southern border, which doesn't exist. They act as if there's an invasion of gang members that are going to kill and rape and plunder the United States, right? That is my point. My point is that the main threat is within the political system. What I'm saying is they're not legally responsible. Obviously, they have a moral responsibility, but they're not legally responsible. But my broader point is that the Buffalo terrorist is not the main threat. The main threat is Republicans undermining the democratic system and using the Great Replacement theory to kind of rile up their base.
What can be done to counter that?
To be honest, very little, because for most measures, be they preventative or repressive, you actually need support from the Republicans, either in Washington or to implement them at the state level or in law enforcement agencies. Now, a recent study shows that about half of Republican supporters believe in the Great Replacement theory. They're not going to implement these policies that you're talking about. So sure, it is easy to have even more repression to target these individuals like the shooter in Buffalo and some others. But the broader problem of the Great Replacement theory, like undermining pretty much the whole idea of America as a multiracial country, that you cannot attack when it is believed by so many people. Many of them, of course, work in legislatures, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, etc.
Even if social media platforms were to be better regulated to curb unfiltered speech, hate speech?
Social media are only a very small part of this. As long as it is belted by Tucker Carlson on Fox News and repeated through Breitbart and all these other things, then whatever Twitter does is simply not that important.
And just to add to that, what about internationally, since this is a theory and a type of radicalization that we're seeing internationally as well?
Well, many countries are nowhere near the problematic level as the US. And so while they have a reasonably strong far-right party, although in Germany, for example, it's not even that strong, the vast majority are still people who believe in liberal democracy and who don't believe in the Great Replacement theory. First and foremost, they have to call it out more. One of the most striking things was when Orban made this speech, various international media didn't even mention his reference to the Great Replacement theory. Both Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel from the European Union congratulated Viktor Orban on a new term, as Viktor Orban was blaming Europe of the EU of committing a suicide of the white people. You can't do those things. You have to choose liberal democracy.
That's a good note to end on. Professor Mudde, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.